Alaska isn't for the faint of heart. It's more than just a state, it's a frozen continent that demands respect and blood. In a land ruled by apex predators and relentless cold, only the bravest souls survive. Good evening, friends. Please leave a like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help me reach my goal of 1,000 subscribers. Now, settle into the darkness and listen closely. Here are 4 true horror stories from the last frontier. Welcome to the cold. The highway unspooled behind me like a tired promise. I was 2 hours out of town, head full of dead playlists and the small, private confidence of someone who thinks a long drive clears the blood from the head. It was supposed to be routine, a delivery run to a remote fish processor, a single-lane road through spruce and alder where trucks passed like funerals. The sky had the flinty color of old coins and the air tasted of damp metal. I remember thinking, stupidly, that the weather itself felt patient, an observation that read back to me as naivete within the hour. I heard the truck before I saw it, a deep, distant rumble that moved through the earth and up through the soles of my boots, a sound like an animal with a bad heart. It wasn't unusual, big rigs ride those roads often. What unsettled me was the rhythm, an uneven, recurring stutter that didn't belong to any engine I'd known. It was as if the truck hesitated on purpose, idling then surging, a sound with a cadence like calculation. I watched the mirror, expecting a familiar cab, a waving hand, the mundane grin of a man who lives on diesel fumes. Instead, headlights bled out through the trees, not sliding past but holding, waiting. I pulled over because the road narrowed and because habit is a poor substitute for intuition. The other driver's lights softened but did not pass. His motor puttered once, twice, and then the driver opened his door and stepped out into the cold like a man testing a puddle. He walked toward my truck with the casual gait of someone who has rehearsed this. At first he was a silhouette, then a face with the tire angles of someone who has been moving through hours and miles, stubble, a cap pulled low, eyes the color of road salt. He smiled with the casualness of a stranger offering help, and the way he said, "Car trouble?" felt like an act written in a handbook about being trusted. I told myself to stay calm, to check the obvious, battery, alternator, blown fuse, because I had training in not panicking. I popped the hood and the cold shoved in, sharp as a confession. The man leaned over the barrier, offering gloved fingers and an efficient set of instructions. He moved like a man used to being needed. When I turned, he had set his flashlight to beam low and was sweeping the roadside with slow, searching arcs. In the grass near the shoulder I noticed something that made my stomach clench, a length of heavy-duty cable coiled like a sleeping snake, the end threaded through a narrow loop and frayed as if it had been used to hold something in place. The cable looked recent. It did not belong to the roadside. "Expect hunters out tonight," he said, as if making small talk. "Coyotes, maybe bears. But trucks cut through here." His voice steadied me and then, perversely, heightened my unease. The way he said trucks cut through here was not informative, it was possessive, as if the route were his jurisdiction. I had a catalog of sensible replies running in my head. Thank you, we'll call a tow, but the simplest truth was raw. I was alone with a man who had chosen to stop here, who had chosen to linger, and who had watched my hood while I fumbled with wires. He offered to drive me to the nearest garage, said his rig was just up the line, that he could do me the favor of a tow. The generosity felt familiar and cheap. My gut, honed in small ways by living alone and moving through empty spaces at odd hours, said no. I declined politely, said the truck would be fine, that a call had been made. He nodded like a man who hears a rehearsed script and accepts it. When I closed the hood, my hands left grease that my pulsing fingers could not hide. The cab door slammed shut with a noise that sounded too loud in the thinning light. I watched him walk back to his lights. He stood with one hand on his hip, the other holding a thermos, and he drank like a man taking a quiet pleasure in warmth. The engine coughed, then idled, then died. He did not climb back into the cab. He looked at me over the hood as if measuring, then turned and ambled toward a copse of small spruce. The rumble returned, fainter now, as if his truck receded. When it stopped, the road was oddly silent, like the breath after someone holds a secret. I imagined him in camp light, in the puff of smoke and metal and a radio turned low, a man with other men, other oaths. The image made my chest knot. In the strip of woods he left behind, I found another clue, a flattened place where someone had sat, and beside it a small spiral notebook wrapped in plastic. I didn't touch it at first. I watched its outline as if the thing could tell me its intentions. The paper inside was thick with shorthand, the kind of notes a driver keeps, but these were not deliveries or meal stops. They were times, initials, and a set of cryptic words: night pick, quiet, no witnesses. My mouth went dry and stupid with fear. The notebook was not a stranger's diary, it was an instruction manual. When I asked whether he'd been waiting for a truck, he laughed, the sound too loud and sharp. Just passing through, he said, and then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded map with certain roads circled in pencil. The circles matched places I'd heard rumors about, pullouts where people had gone missing, sections of road where cell service was a rumor. He tapped one of the circles like a bishop on a map and said, "People get lost out here. People forget to call." The observation landed like a verdict. In that moment the world narrowed into the simple, cold ledger of possibility, a place with little oversight, a man who made it his business to be present in the margins, a road that could hide arrangements until it was too late. I told myself the notebook was coincidence, that people keep odd lists, and my imagination was as tired as my muscles. That lie lasted until dusk, when the road folded into a low, hard fog and the truck's engine hiccuped again and died entirely. The man reappeared as if conjured, his silhouette a shape I had memorized by then, the cap, the thermos, the slow, practiced gait. He offered the same help with the same smile. The difference was his patience. He waited as if he had nowhere urgent to be and everything to gain by lingering. We spoke like neighbors forced to perform civility. He asked about where I was headed, and when I said home his eyes softened with an economy that looked too practiced to be kindness. "You shouldn't be alone out here after dark," he said. "Bad things happen when nobody's watching." It was a proverb and a threat shaped into small talk. I thanked him and fumbled for my phone. It was a dead rectangle that glowed like a useless altar. When I asked again about towing, his voice dropped to a conspiratorial tone. "I can take you," he said. "If you want. No charge. You can trust me." I felt the anchor of instinct pull me two ways, toward the human impulse to accept help, toward the animal sense that this man had rehearsed his generosity. He gestured to his old rig, a hulking silhouette in the fog, its cab warm and smelling of coffee and cigarettes. A rational part of me argued in tidy syllogisms: trucks break down, drivers help, most offers are benign. The rest of me counted the signs stacked like quiet accusations, the cable, the notebook, the circles on the map, and the list tightened into a throat. I declined again, but with less energy. He smiled like a man accepting an opening and reached into his pocket and set something on the hood of my truck, a small folded sheet with a number and the initials R. It was casual cruelty: leave a card, be available. I decided to wait at the roadside until dawn, to sit with the engine off and let the cold bleed into my bones. Night dissolved the world into texture and rumor. Around midnight the sound began, not the long, steady rumble of a highway truck, but the distinct periodic thud of heavy tires rolling slow and then stopping. It was deliberate, an approach and a pause. I watched from my windshield as a shape slid up behind the cops and stopped near the place where I'd found the coil cable earlier. A second truck eased in, lights off, breathing like a held animal. Figures moved with the clinical silence of people doing a trade in the dark. They unpacked something long and flat, wrapped in tarp. I watched them move in a raw, helpless rage swelled, how polite the world is to hide its rituals in shadow. They worked with the efficiency of men who had practiced moving burdens when curiosity would be fatal. At one point a flashlight swept the shoulder where I'd been sitting and its beam warmed my face like accusation. The man with the thermos called softly and they answered, voices low and practiced. He nodded once, as if the exchange had been expected. The men folded the tarp as if hiding clothing. They arranged the coiled cable and checked knots with the care of butchers. The choreography was precise. The scene was a humane factory line for disappearance. My fingers found the radio and I tried to key it, to speak a simple sentence, state your location, request assistance, but the little box answered with static and then a canned voice, out of range. Panic sharpened into movement. I started the truck and tried to back the way I'd come, but the road I used was filled and blocked. Someone had shifted earth or placed small logs to discourage a hasty retreat. They had planned for that. The honesty of it, preparation for keeping someone from leaving, was colder than any scream I could imagine. I gunned the engine and made a clumsy arc, tires screaming through mud, and fled with the image of men folding tarps hammered behind my eyes. I made it to the ranger station on a raw, ragged edge. The rangers took me seriously because my story had the texture of evidence, mud on boots, a radio with a live static, the thermos card on the hood. They organized a sweep immediately, headlights cutting through the fog like knives, dogs eager for scent. The search that night felt cinematic until dawn, when the forest revealed its routine cruelty in full detail, a shallow grave covered with bracken, a bundle wrapped in a tarp still damp, the imprint of knots and rope. The sight of it turned bile into a roar and my stomach folded around a new, brutal understanding. This was not random violence, it was a business. People were being moved, hidden, collected. They pulled the tarp back with a slow, procedural reverence. The face they found was slack and ordinary, a man in a jacket, mouth open as if surprised, and on his wrist a cheap watch stopped at 9:27 p.m. The identification came later, through calls and the dull bureaucracy of next of kin, a fisherman who had missed dinner, a name that fit too easily into the ledger of small disappearances. The autopsy spoke in clinical terms, blunt force trauma, asphyxia, a pattern consistent with restraint and concealment. Those clinical words made the horror into a kind of arithmetic. The numbers were precise and terrible. The notebooks stacked by the lean-tos told a worse story. They contained lists, names, times, preferred routes, notes on reactions to offers of help. Hesitant after 11 p.m., good target, one entry read in a hand that cared little for decency. The men had turned the highway into a hunting ground, using the loneliness of the road and the trust people place in open hands to select victims. It was organized, a small, gruesome industry that used trucks and thermoses as tools. The banality of the implements, the thermos, the coffee cups, the help offers, made the crime more horrific because it could happen anywhere where people trusted strangers on remote roads. When the arrests came, they were messy and imperfect. Some men were detained quickly, others slipped away into the mesh of remote roads and sympathetic faces. In questioning, one of the detained men explained it with the casual language of logistics. They moved people for work, he said, evasive and soft, as if they had arranged a contract rather than robbed a life. His defense was technical and unrepentant. He spoke of demand and supply and referred to victims as loads. The vocabulary stripped their humanity with clinical efficiency. Listening to him, the room turned cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. After the initial sweep, the town began the rituals of repair, signs warning drivers, volunteer escorts during late hours, hotlines posted at the gas station. They called it a success, arrests made, bodies found, a ring dismantled. But the success was partial, like a bandage on a deep wound. There were always roads that were less patrolled, nights when cell service flagged, and men who could find an advantage in a kindness refused or a help accepted. The ledger of horror had margins, and the men who filled them had networks that replaced apprehended members with others. The emotional fallout was corrosion. I could not sleep without dreaming of engines idling and the soft clack of boots. Every truck passing my home felt like a potential enactor of violence. I turned down offers of rides and watched faces in diners with a calculation I didn't want. The raw, practical lesson I carried home was that the world is hospitable to harm when it hides in ordinary gestures: a truck's grunt, a thermos proffered, a map circled with pencil. The horror was not spectacular, it was mundane and therefore replicable. Months later, the court system hammered out sentences and the newspapers printed photos with grainy captions. Families collected small measures of closure that were not closure. They got apologies stylized into statements, and some reparations that never measured up to absence. I kept the man's card that had been left on my hood. It lived in my glove compartment like a curse I could misplace but not forget. Sometimes I would take it out and look at the initials and feel the metallic taste of fear again. The thing that gnawed at me longest was not the violence itself but the social architecture that made it possible: lonely highways, patchy networks of care, the instinct to trust a hand stretched out in the dark. The men had exploited that architecture like cartographers of cruelty, mapping spots where aloneness could be turned into supply. The sound of a truck on an empty road will never be the same for me. It has an undertone now, a rhythm of intent that my ear has learned to hear. The arrests that followed were a slow, grinding thing: police reports, warrants, a dozen small triumphs that tasted of copper. Men sat in interrogation rooms and tried to recast their handiwork as commerce, as prank, as misread opportunity. Some of them folded under questions, others smiled with the blankness of someone used to watching faces and knowing how to read relief as permission. The prosecutions moved forward on evidence I could still feel under my fingernails: the coil cable, the thermos, the notebooks with columns of names and times. Paper and images made the horror legible, and legibility forced a system to act. Courtrooms are antiseptic theaters. Families brought faded photographs, voices thin with waiting. I listened as a woman read a victim's last text aloud, and the letters turned into an indictment louder than any prosecutor. The men's lawyers argued semantics, consent, intent, reasonable doubt, while the notebooks lay in evidence like nails. When a jury finally spoke, the verdicts came in numbers and months. Some men were convicted, others took plea deals. The sentences could not thread back the hours stolen, but they made the ledger harder to keep open for anyone who might follow the same ledgered method. After it was over in courts and headlines, the town stitched itself as well as it could. Patrols increased, volunteer escorts were organized, and a small hotline flashed on the county website like a promise. People started sharing routes on social apps, strangers organized rides and check-ins. Those were ordinary, mundane repairs that mattered. They did not erase what had happened, but they changed the arithmetic of opportunity. Where there had been empty road and quiet complicity, there was now noise and witnesses. The deepest wound was quieter, private. For months I woke to the phantom thud of tires outside my window, the imagined idle of engines that used to be only background. I flinched at thermoses offered with a generosity that should have been harmless. Trust, a slender, everyday currency, felt spent. I found myself cataloging faces in diners, counting boots on porches, measuring the ease with which a stranger could become a procedure. The forest of my life had not been razed, but the map had been rewritten in ink that would not wash out. There were nights when the mind created monsters to make sense of men, spectral rigs crawling the highway, a supernatural gaze that could be fought with prayer or ritual. Those stories are comforting because monsters are simple: you name them and you set a trap. The true horror that kept me awake was not cinematic. It was bureaucratic and banal: men with notebooks who learned to make aloneness into inventory, a landscape in which kindness could be weaponized, systems that responded only after a ledger grew heavy enough to topple. So I changed habits. I never leave alone after dusk without telling at least 3 people, and I carry a GPS tracker that broadcasts to a known circle. I no longer accept the first offer of help on a lonelier stretch. I photograph plate numbers and note exact times. Small, clumsy precautions, but effective in their way. Safety, I learned, is not a feeling but a practice. Redundancies, witnesses, the slow accretion of attention that makes a highway less hospitable to a predator's quiet work. Sometimes I drive by the bend where I found the coiled cable and slow down until the world suspends in my windshield, trees, shoulder, the faint scar of a flattened place. The road looks ordinary, a ribbon of asphalt that carries freight and commutes, and the ordinary risk of a flat tire. That ordinariness is the scariest part, the recognition that cruelty dressed itself in the habitual and succeeded because we assume routine is neutral. The men we put away were human, methodical, and therefore frighteningly replicable. That truth is a bleaker ghost than anything supernatural. In the end, the thing I came back with most insisted on being practical. Horror can be named, boxed, and used in court, but the remedy is communal, people watching for each other, slow protocols that interrupt a predator's routine, a willingness to question offers that feel too neat. The highway keeps rumbling, engines still thud like tired hearts. I no longer hear them the same way. I listen for rhythm and intent, and I make sure someone else knows where I am. It is a small, stubborn dignity, an answer to the ledger that once listed us as loads, and it is the only antidote I have found to a terror that was always human, always possible, and therefore worth resisting. The GPS pulsed at my thumb like a small, impatient heart. I had always trusted that tiny blue dot more than my instincts. It had guided me out of wrong turns and into brilliant overlooks and, once, saved me from a thunderstorm on a back road that ran like a vein through the forest. That day I was chasing light, the thin, brutal gold that cuts through spruce in late September, and a route that the device swore should be there. The screen said 3 miles, the map showed a ribbon of road that swooped and rejoined the highway. I believed it because it was convenient and because belief is a soft shelter. The gravel road dissolved into a barely kept track and my truck protested with stones rattling under the wheel wells. Radio static made the cab feel small and the light leaned amber as if the woods around me had bruised the sky. Then the dot on my phone stilled and the voice said, in that polite computerized lilt, recalculating. My chest tightened. I slowed, hearing the vehicle's engine like a small animal behind glass. Trees pressed close. For a minute the only sound was the tick of cooling metal and my own breath, and that intimacy made fear grow teeth. I took the next turn where my device promised exit and found nothing but a web of ruts leading to a collapsed fence and an abandoned logging pad. The map on my screen showed I was still on the road. The world under my boots told a different story. No recent tire rubs, only tracks that belonged to older, heavier machines. I stepped out, boots sinking into mud, and the air tasted like iron and old batteries. My hands, at once professional and absurdly personal, checked signal bars and tapped icons as if I could will the map to confess a mistake. The GPS was calm and smug. I felt stupid for expecting honesty from a machine. I backtracked and tried the other fork. The blue dot moved as if embarrassed, jittering sideways then resuming its lie. My rational mind made a list, outdated maps, software glitch, satellite lag. The list is useful until it isn't. The forest closed its ranks, the sky dimmed with a patience that felt punitive. I reached for the CB radio and found only silence beneath the hiss. I called the office and the line cut like a thread. Every tool I trusted was small, finite, and failing. The realization had the shape of a mouth opening slowly. At the edge of the logging pad I saw fresh prints in the soft gravel, 2 sets, deep and deliberate, tread pattern I recognized from the crew trucks that serviced the camps, a heavy boot and then a narrower sole. The prints led away into a stand of alder and then vanished. Beside them, someone had placed a marker, a strip of reflective tape tied to a sapling, slit clean at one end like a ribbon cut with a purpose. Whoever put it there had known how people followed signs. Whoever put it there had expected someone to follow. My skin tightened like the drum of a snare. I recorded a note into my pocket recorder with a voice that didn't sound like mine. GPS shows route. Physical evidence contradicts. 2 sets of boots. Marker present. Saying the words felt like stepladders toward sanity and also like a confession that the map could be weaponized. I told myself the marker might be a hunter's trail ribbon, a legitimate human convenience. I told myself a dozen rational things because doing so delayed the cold, efficient creep of horror. I pushed on because I had to know whether the lie in my device was a pocket of wilderness indifference or something else, something deliberate. The track narrowed, then disappeared under a carpet of leaves. My hands found the wheel of my truck and then let go. The air smelled faintly of diesel and something else I couldn't name at first, burned plastic or the metallic tang of long exposed blood. The hairs on my arms lifted the way they do before a storm. With every careful step the world rearranged itself into a dozen small threads, a snapped branch that might be a tripwire, the sudden hush that announces a predator's attention, the sense of being watched by eyes that count and catalog. Late afternoon folded into a low, heavy dusk. The forest swallowed light like a beast devouring its prey. In a small hollow by a creek I found evidence that made the rational scaffolding collapse, a length of rope with fibers frayed as if used and scrubbed, a scrap of orange safety vest with mud on one edge, and, folded and hidden under a stone, a scrap of paper with a scrawled phone number and a time, 9:30 p.m., with the word pickup underlined twice. My stomach dropped as if someone had opened a trapdoor beneath me. It was a note that belonged to logistics, to human arrangement, not to weather or whim. It meant someone had a plan here and that plan had a timetable. My hands shook when I photographed the items. The camera's clicks sounded disproportionately loud in the hush. I could feel my anonymity being pried open like an oyster shell. The GPS on my dash blinked like an accusation. I imagined, stupidly, a supernatural overlay, the device possessed or the forest enchanted, mapping men into monsters. The fantasy was absurd and briefly comforting. Monsters have motives you can name. But the objects under my boots insisted on a less tidy horror, people arranging pickups, alerting each other, setting times and places where someone could be taken or handed off. A small industry of disappearance operated with quiet, terrifying efficiency. The idea lodged in me like a cold stone. The device hadn't lied by accident. Someone had engineered the route into an instrument of control. I moved with deliberate slowness, every step rehearsed to look casual though my muscles coiled. The forest seemed to swallow sound but not intention. My breath came quick and shallow, like a frightened animal. I followed the smeared vest and the rope prints deeper into it older, and the feeling that I had walked into someone's choreography grew with every careful footprint. The GPS on my lap mocked me with a steady blue line that insisted I was on the correct path. My eyes told me otherwise, tracks that led sideways, then stopped, signs of someone pausing to adjust something, to listen, to wait. I set up a small camera and a fork of branches, camouflaged with leaves, and left it running like a prayer. Doing something felt like resistance. Hours thinned into a tense afternoon. I rationed water and tried to keep the recorder going, telling myself this was field work, a matter of documentation. But documentation has a loner's loneliness. It translates horror into lists and lists still terror into data. I played the rational games. What if it's smugglers? What if it's hunters? But each hypothesis folded under the specifics, the cut tape, the tape pickup time, the repeated smoothing of tracks. At dusk I heard a vehicle, a distant rumble that should have been welcome, but when the sound drew near it turned into a threat of dread. A pickup eased onto the logging track, headlights off, like a phantom sliding into place. It did not disturb the leaves, it was careful. My hands went cold as the truck stopped a little way off and figures moved with the hush of practiced hands. 2 people stepped from the truck, their faces obscured by caps and the angles of their hoods. They moved with economy, no wasted motion, checked the undergrowth, exchanged a soft grunt, and then one climbed down into the hollow where the rope lay and began to work with tools that flashed briefly in the last light. Their silhouettes were ordinary: blue jeans, work boots, a jacket with a small logo sewn on the breast. Ordinary things made their intent feel worse. This was not some feral horror but a craft, practiced and organized. Everything in me wanted to run and to scream. Instead I crouched, muscles locked, and watched them as if from behind glass. They worked not like thieves but like technicians: a quick nod, a hidden cache, the folding of something that might be a tarp or a body bag. The man with the cap spoke low into a radio, and a voice answered with a clipped affirmation. They checked their phones briefly, comparing times and routes, then looked up and scanned the trees with a predatory calm that felt trained. For a breath I imagined that they had not noticed me. Then one of them lifted his face, and for an instant his eyes caught mine through the screen of branches. The way he didn't react made my skin go hard. He smiled as if he recognized me and also did not recognize me, as if a registry existed where everyone had a place. I retreated backward, keeping my movements spare and indistinct, until a root snagged my ankle and my toe turned with an obscene pop. One of them turned, moving faster than the others, and for the first time the machine of their vigilance felt personal. He moved through the underbrush with a speed that spoke of practice, and when he called out it was not a shout but a low, conversational question: "You lost?" The tone was casual, roommate kind, but the implication was a net. I lied smoothly about my truck stalling, stuck to a story about a wrong turn. He offered help too soon, the way people offer help when it suits their plan to be close to you. His hands were large, the fingers quick. He gestured toward the logging road as if guiding me to safety while leading me into a choice that was not mine. When he asked to see my ID, I handed it over because the part of me that wanted to survive wanted proof of normalcy. He studied it as if cataloging name, address, birthday, then slid it into his pocket with a slow motion that meant ownership. His partner watched me like a man checking the brand on a tool. They moved with the practiced ease of people who had been at this often, selecting, judging, deciding. I felt like a specimen under inspection. The ordinary kindness of offering a lift was a ritual I had been rehearsed for. Their truck idled and the radio's low murmur sounded harmless. Their hands moved around the cab as if adjusting straps. My throat tightened into a hard knot. I tried to keep my voice level, to suggest I was okay, but my eyes watched every motion, every concealment, every small ritual that was not for survival but for efficiency. I saw in their pockets the corner of a folded paper, edges browned, the same print and ink style as the pickup note. The recognition landed like a punch. The plan on the paper matched the living choreography in front of me. They had schedules and pickup points and times. People were commodities in a ledger and forests were the warehouses. The fact that they spoke politely made the cruelty colder. Crime performed politely is a different terror than the hiss danger of a mucker. It's bureaucratic, methodical, human. I told them I needed to get an update from my office and asked for directions back to the main road, stalling. The man with the radio leaned close and smiled with too many teeth. He said the routes around here were confusing for visitors, that people sometimes had to wait for rides late at night and that things could happen. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, voice a blend of concern and an edge that announced a ledger being tallied. His partner moved closer and their presence formed a soft cordon. My heart hammered a furious tattoo. I counted to 3 and when I lunged it was not the panicked sprint of a deer but a calculated run, forward, then diagonally, cutting across a small gulch where the undergrowth tangled them up for a moment. The resulting chase was a lesson in terror. They adapted quickly, cursing softly, boots thudding with lethal familiarity. The man with the radio snarled and for the first time his voice broke into something sharp and human. I felt the hot breath of pursuit, heard the rasp of leaves and the percussion of hands against soil. Panic changed me into a machine of survival. I moved through the forest by memory and anger. Branches tore at my face, the underbrush grabbed my legs, the world became a series of obstacles to be conquered. Adrenaline stripped everything into pure possibility: run, hide, scream, survive. I slipped into a narrow wash and flattened myself under a ledge, the stones biting into my ribs. My breath came in ricochets. I could hear them pass above me, voices close enough to feel the heat of their breath. Search the hollows, one said, patient and procedural, check for tracks. It was terrifying to hear procedure in the mouth of people who had used it to conceal atrocities. They were organized, they had checklists. The thought that followed was worse. If they had schedules and checklists, they could be counting people, tallying, reducing lives to entries. The safety I had always felt in the map of human decency collapsed. I wanted to vomit. After they moved on, I waited until the forest returned to its usual, indifferent noises. When I made my escape, I found my truck mangled like a trap, flat tire, slashed hose, and a smear on the driver's seat that looked like old grease or blood. The vandalism was a message and a mechanism. They had the patience to immobilize me and the cruelty to leave me vulnerable. I drove, limping, at the edge of control, inches from hyperventilation, and made it to the ranger station just as the sun gave up its last warmth. I stumbled in, a mess of leaves and fear, and the ranger's eyes were like small moons, reflective and bright. The office moved with an efficiency I had not known it possessed. Radios crackled, boots hit the earth, and for a moment I felt rescue like a tide. They brought in K9 units, infrared cameras, and a team that combed the hollows with a meticulous anger. When they found the lean-to and the stack of notebooks, the world narrowed again. Faces on Polaroids, sticky notes with times and names, detailed notes on methods of improvising disappearances, what to say, where to hide, how to make a trail seem accidental. Those pages were a bureaucracy of cruelty, the administrative side of abduction. The evidence made the horror administrative and therefore more plausible. The rangers' faces when they read certain lines cut me deeper than anything in the forest had. Targets who travel light, reacts well to confusion, pick up 9:30 confirmed. That passive voice translated into a human horror that didn't need monsters. They arrested 3 men within a week, not because heroism prevailed but because paper and camera and dog tracks made the dossier too heavy to ignore. The county prosecutors moved with the dry, grinding mechanics of law, not a trumpet of justice so much as a slow machine that chews and sorts. In court the men wore the blank faces of people accustomed to being examined. They called their actions logistics and field work and spoke of patterns as if human beings were weather phenomena to be charted. The defense tried to trade curiosity for consent. Their lawyers called it an ethical lapse, not a campaign of coercion. The language felt obscene, a taxon of euphemisms dressing cruelty and civility. Families came into the courtroom carrying photographs that smelled faintly of home. One woman pressed a picture into my hands and said nothing. Her silence was a verdict. A stack of Polaroids, the same ones found in the lean-to, went into evidence and turned the men's smiling faces at picnic tables into the faces of people who had practiced disappearance. The prosecutor read pages from the notebooks aloud, times, locations, notes on reactions, checklists for isolating a subject. Hearing those words out loud made them physical and undeniable. I watched a man whose name I had logged in my field notes take the stand and try to answer. He squinted as if the record had been awkwardly misfiled. The horror of their casual precision had weight now. It could be cited, cross-examined, cataloged. Convictions came in stages, some pleaded, some were sentenced, but the legal machinery cannot refill the hours of terror or unring the small betrayals. The ranger who had taken my initial report said later, with a tired kind of honesty, that without the camera and my recordings it would have been his word against their plausible stories. We had piled the minutiae high enough to make a mountain. That reality felt like triumph until I realized the mountain was the thing they had been building all along, pages and pages of ordinary acts compiled into method. Afterward, the forest did not feel safe in the way it had been before. Safety did not return, it was replaced by a different, sharper awareness. I stopped going alone. I left routes with friends, made my check-ins redundant, and carried a panic kit that felt like a small, graceless talisman. Night terrors braided with daily caution, every fix of the GPS became suspect, every rustle a hypothesis. I caught myself cataloging strangers' shoes on the trail, measuring how often they paused to glance behind them. I had become the sort of person who survived by turning attention into armor. The most insidious residue was the knowledge that the machinery that makes horror banal was not exotic. It was paperwork, it was quiet professionalism, it was planning calendars and pickup times and men's casual voices on radios. That bureaucracy made the crime replicable. It taught me the terrifying lesson that evil doesn't always roar, often it arranges itself like a meeting agenda. The men had exploited normalcy, a cab pulled to the roadside, a polite offer of assistance, a time stamped on a scrap of paper. Those small social currencies, help, politeness, indifference, were repurposed into instruments of harm. Months later I stood at the creek where the rope had lain and watched the water unhurriedly erase footprints. A county plaque had been nailed to a tree with information about reporting suspicious activity, a pale bureaucratic badge of prevention. It helped, in the way bandages help a wound that still leaks. I took photographs, but now my images serve double lives, beauty catalog for others, evidence catalog for myself. The camera became a witness and a talisman and an ugly reminder that without proof the forest keeps its secrets. Sometimes at night I hear that radio voice in my head, flat, efficient, and for a moment the world snaps brittle. I have nightmares of maps that reconfigure themselves into traps, of blue dots that pulse like a heartbeat you cannot trust. But those cinematic fears are only part of it. The true horror is quieter, a system that allows the gradual accumulation of opportunity, neighbors who shrug when small concerns are raised, bureaucracies that prefer tidy forms over messy truths. That is a terror with no claws, only paperwork, and because it's plausible it is more terrifying than any imagined beast. If there is an end to the story, it is small and practical. The town started volunteer patrols, rangers increased sweeps, signage changed, and hikers organized to share routes. Those measures matter. They are the thin, human corrections that slow a machine of cruelty. We learn to trade solitude for redundancy. We learn that being seen is sometimes the best safeguard. I do not pretend I am wholly healed. The woods still call me, and I return on days when I need light, but I go with company and with cameras turned to record. The lesson the forest taught me was brutal and simple. Safety is a practice, not an assumption. The horror that found me was not supernatural. It was procedural, human-made, and therefore frighteningly possible for anyone who trusts a blue dot and the kindness of strangers. The forest closed around me like a lung collapsing. Daylight thinned to a gray that smelled of wet earth and old leaves. My boots sank with a soft, accusing sound. I had gone out alone to clear my head, one of those cliched escapes people recommend when life tightens, but the woods do not care for cliches. They are patient and indifferent and precise in ways that make you feel small. I told myself I knew these trails. I knew the map in my head, that conviction unraveled on a single, wrong step where something heavy had gouged the moss. At first I thought it was a fallen log, then shifting light, then the stray work of a bear. The gouge was too straight. Drag marks, long and shallow, scored the ground in a brutal, even rhythm, as if something had been hauled not once but repeatedly. My stomach dropped like a stone and tasted of bile. I listened for the snap of branches that would mean an animal, or a human, was near. Nothing answered but the pallid susurrus of leaves. The rational part of me listed explanations: a downed utility pole, illegal dumping, a hunter's careless path. None of those soothed the raw edge of fear that pricked my neck. I moved closer and the air changed, metallic, faintly sour, like the smell you get when an engine has been running too long in an enclosed space. There was a length of rope half buried in the duff, fibers dark with something that wasn't dirt. I touched it with the pad of a gloved finger and the thread came away damp and sticky. My breath turned shallow and small as if the world had shrunk to the circumference of that rope. Images that belonged to other people's headlines slid into my head, people found bound, bodies staged to look like accidents, images I had convinced myself were horrors that happened to others. For the first time the idea that someone could be here, not by accident but by design, felt horribly plausible. The tracks continued toward a thicket where the brush had been groomed into an improvised path. It was too neat. Someone had moved deliberately, made choices about where to step to avoid tearing roots, like a person used to moving on two legs and trying not to announce themselves. I found imprints in the mud, boots, yes, but also a patch of scuffed earth where something large had been dragged and the moss had been stripped bare. Near it, marred by cigarette ash and the smeared outline of a hand, lay a scrap of cloth with a pattern I recognized from discount work shirts sold at hardware stores 2 towns over. Ordinary things make the mind do extraordinary work. The cloth tethered possibility to reality, a real shirt, a real body, a real person whose absence might be recent. My hands shook when I photographed the scene. The camera's autofocus hunted in the dim and coughed like an old man. I spoke notes into the recorder I kept clipped to my belt, my voice too loud in the quiet. Drag mark, approximate length 5 meters. Possible human transport. Rope present. Suspected foul play. Saying the words made them solid, as if by making a sentence I could pin the horror down and take the sting away. But the words also carried weight. Foul play is not a hypothesis you whisper and then forget. It multiplies, it summons obligations. I found other signs, the crushed shell of a utility lighter, a pill bottle with the label worn off so the name meant nothing, a child's mitten caked with mud and something darker at the cuff. Each ordinary object stacked like proof, reducing excuses until the only explanations left were the worst. Panic rose as a slow pulmonary thing, not the ragged gasp of sudden fright but a steady constriction that made planning impossible. I realized then that I had been followed for part of the morning, not by the animal logic of predators, but by an intelligence that tracked patterns and waited for opportunities. The thought that the trail had been laid for me, tested, refined, cataloged, settled into me like a cold stone. I tried to be the professional in the field, to clip on my vest and call it evidence collection, but method only buys you breathing room, not absolution. I marked the coordinates, took overlapping photographs, bagged the cloth and the rope, labeled them with neat ink that felt obscene against the grime. Every object I touched registered in my hands like a confession. The recorder in my jacket captured the quiet, a wind that sounded like a sigh, and my own breaths, too loud. I told myself to call it in, but my phone showed no bars and the SAT unit hummed anemic at 2% battery. Alone, the responsibility felt heavier than the pack on my shoulders. I pushed deeper where the drag marks led, forcing my body to make decisions in the way the person who plans an ambush must already have made them. The thicket opened to a slope and at the bottom, under a rotted pallet half hidden by ferns, I found signs of recent occupation, a thermos with coffee gone cold, a pair of gloves placed one inside the other like an offering, cigarette butts aligned on a log as if someone had a ritual for keeping count. Near the pallet, a shallow depression in the lungs smelled faintly of oil and something more human, sweat, fear, the iron tang of blood. I knelt and the mud resisted my glove, clinging wetly. When I brushed it back, the edge of a shoe heel revealed a scuff pattern exactly like the tread I had seen earlier. My rational mind kept trying to install safety rails. Maybe they were hunters, maybe a tarp blew in from a campsite, maybe someone had discarded supplies. Each plausible explanation slid off the evidence like oil. The more I tried to categorize, the more the evidence configured itself as intent. The palette had been chosen carefully to hide things from aerial view. The cigarette butts were not random but counted. The rope's fibers had a sheen that spoke of recent stress. Someone was living here between patrols, practicing stealth. Someone had been preparing. Someone had dragged a body, perhaps, to that very pallet and moved it later. The thought lodged like an infection. I had crossed into an active space where someone staged rehearsals of disappearance. Panic narrowed into a precise, animal realization. If this person wanted to take someone, they had already rehearsed the logistics. The HUD becomes a procedure. Procedures are frightening because they are repeatable. I felt the cold slide along the spine of certainty. This was not impulsive violence, it was calculated, grotesquely calm. I set the camera on a tripod in the cover of ferns and pointed it back toward the slope, framing the palette and the trail. It felt like setting a trap for truth. The sun dropped and the light thinned, the forest retracting into shadows that made everything sharper and crueler. Night here is a thick thing that breathes smaller fears into monstrous shapes. I sat against a tree, knees braced, listening. Hours crawled, the camera's red LED blinked like the iris of some small, patient animal. At about midnight a soft sound, steps, precise and light, came downhill. My mouth made no sound, my body became all ears. A figure slipped into view, not running but moving with the practiced economy of someone who knows how to avoid being noticed. He wore a cap pulled low and a jacket that seemed stitched from the same shadow. He paused at the pallet, removed a can of food, and set it down with the care of someone placing a relic. He looked straight at the camera without pausing, without revealing, as if to test whether the thing watched as he watched. Then he reached into the hollow beneath the pallet and produced a small notebook wrapped in plastic, scribbled into it with a pen, and slid it back. His hands were not hurried, they were patient instruments. When he turned and walked away, he did so in a way that suggested this scene had been performed many times and would be again. My stomach clenched so hard I nearly retched. The camera had recorded him, someone would see. But who would I tell? My phone would die, the SAT unit would blink and go. I wanted to run to town, to the ranger's office, to anyone who could make this solid and not a thing of conjecture. Instead I crouched in place like an animal that has been taught to fear movement. I watched the trail where his footprints blurred into darkness and felt both revulsion and a perverse clarity. This person was methodical, almost reverent in his routines. He kept logs, he cataloged movement like a scientist cataloging specimens. That slow, domestic calm was the most terrifying part, a horror dressed as realism. I replayed the footage in my head, his hands, the way the pen scratched, the slow, unhurried breath. The thought that he might have a list of names, of times, of people practicing ordinary things that could become prey, turned nausea into fury. I imagined him reading a file and checking boxes like new, vulnerable, good night. I tried to imagine what obligation to the living meant in a landscape where someone could arrange disappearance like a craft. The image burned, stacks of notebooks, meticulous notes on routes and behaviors, the reduction of a human to a set of observed reactions. The forest's indifference met human deliberateness and birthed a new kind of terror, mundane, procedural, and therefore plausible. I forced myself to move before dawn. I packed the tripod and camera, took one last photo of the palette, and ripped the cordoning ribbons I'd left earlier into smaller pieces. I left the larger pieces where they were evidence for a later team, but I stuffed the smaller pieces into my jacket pockets like talismans. On the hike back the trail felt watched in a way I had never experienced before. Every broken twig was a sentinel. I wanted to believe the man was some loner, an eccentric with a notebook collecting stories. I also knew the cold algebra possibility, patterns repeat. The question that hammered me with every step was not whether he would strike, only when and whom. I left the trail at first light because staying felt like consenting to be catalogued. I ran until my lungs burned and my calves cramped, until the trees thinned and a logging road opened like a sudden, merciful wound. I found a ranger with coffee-stained hands and told him everything in a voice that cracked. The words tumbled out, breathless and precise: drag marks, rope, the pallet, the man at midnight with his notebook. He listened, eyes tightening, then moved with the blunt, decisive motion of someone who has learned how to translate fear into procedure. A team was called. Radios snapped like insects. For the first time since the rope, panic traded places with a flicker of hope. They took the camera footage, my samples, the smaller strips of ribbon I hidden in my pockets. The ranger's face, up close, was an ugly mix of pity and professional anger. He used words like stalking and pattern as if they could stitch order onto what had been done. Search parties combed the slope where the pallet lay, flashlights slicing at ferns until the morning brightened into a glare that made everything honest and raw. They found his camp 40 minutes downriver, a lean-to masked with branches, a stack of notebooks, plastic sleeves full of notes, Polaroids with faces I recognized only because I'd seen them in local posters, missing persons faded at the edges. The notebooks were a litany, dates, times, clothing descriptions, responses to greetings, notations like new sample, reacts well to confusion, leaves at dusk. Those pages were confession and curriculum both. The handwriting was neat, patient, monstrous in its ordinariness. They arrested a man who smelled like ash and cheap cologne, whose face when stripped of disguise looked smaller and younger than the photos in his file. He had an answer for everything, the practiced denials of someone who has rehearsed plausible stories. I was studying behavior, I meant no harm, they consented to be observed. His voice was flat. He couched cruelty in scholarship. The judge liked technicalities and the defense talked about curiosity and ethics. The prosecutor talked about coercion and terror. The court would later parse the ritual into counts and clauses, but in the woods the ledger had already been written in printouts and ash and human smears. Families came to the hearing and their faces were raw with a grief sharpened by disbelief. One woman held a photo with hands that trembled hard enough to blur the picture. She pressed it into my palm like a small, imploring thing and said simply, "We told them." Her words were not accusation as much as a brutal truth. People have reported patterns, noticed odd men on trails, filed complaints that dissolved into records labeled no evidence. The horror revealed itself as an institution's failure to listen, a municipal shrug that allowed a quiet predator to develop a method and a market. After the arrests, the town offered the consolation it knows how to give: meetings, signs warning hikers, a volunteer patrol with orange vests, and a map of cleared routes. They patched the trail with bright tape and organized a safety walk where people who love the woods learned to measure fear. That public response felt necessary and yet incomplete. The real wound was not the removal of one predator but the recognition that the forest had been a receptive place for someone who preferred patience over violence. The bureaucratic fix was neat, but it did not erase that the method had been possible because no one had enforced the small attentions: more patrols, quicker responses to odd reports, neighbors calling each other at dusk. The immediate terror faded into a slower, harder residue. Nights became a test. A parked car's creak would unknot me. A shadow at the window would write its own little report in my mind. I started leaving my camera on a timer when I walked, a talisman and a technological witness, but the security felt thin, a gadget pretending to be justice. I found myself watching faces on trails the way others watch weather, calculating risk, measuring tolerance. The knowledge that someone could learn your rhythm and weight did not evaporate with his handcuffs. It lodged in me like a splinter that refused any simple extraction. Sometimes, in the quiet between sleep and waking, I would hear the recorded voice of the man as if it were a stain on the air, soft, detached, describing people as data points. That voice became an emblem of a different horror, banal, bureaucratic, profoundly human. The worst revelation was not that there were monsters, it was that ordinary men with clipboards and a patience for rehearsal could turn curiosity into cruelty. The forest did not change. It kept doing what it always had, hiding things until someone bothered to look. The change, if it existed, lived in small practices: neighbors calling after dusk, rangers checking routes more often, signs that asked for vigilance instead of placation. I went back once, months later, and walked slowly through that slope. The pallet was gone, all the way in some neat disposal, and the ferns had grown over the shallow divots where the drag marks had been. My camera, strapped to my chest, felt heavier than before, a piece of witness. I took photographs not to find beauty but to make a ledger, a picture of a mud track, a close-up of a boot print, a snapped twig. The woods received my attention without surprise. The horror of what had happened there remained practical and plausible. Someone watched, someone cataloged, someone decided my life could be experimented on. That knowledge is worse than any ghost because it could happen again to any of us who walk alone and assume the world will look after its own. In the end, the terror I carried was not cinematic. It wasn't a roving beast with fangs. It was quiet and methodical, an economy of observation that treated people as data until they disappeared into evidence. I learned to share my routes with friends, to check in with a cadence that felt like armor. I still hear the soft scrape of a footstep in the underbrush sometimes, and I cannot help cataloging it instantly. The notebooks the man kept went into evidence. His trial did not undo the slow harm of being mapped, watched, and chosen. The most frightening thing I learned in those deep woods was that the ordinary world contains systems and people capable of procedural cruelty, that horror wears sensible boots and a calm voice, and it can be practiced by any of us who decides someone else is only material for study. The trail swallowed like the way a mouth swallows a voice. I'd set out that morning with a camera and a mild, professional arrogance, the kind you wear when you tell people you're a nature photographer and they nod as if you might also cure small civic ills. The forest at first was polite, birch trunks, moss like velvet, bird calls that flicked and vanished. I followed the blazed markers and the GPS breadcrumb. I told myself I was only exploring, only taking pictures. The joke is that the woods are indifferent to intention. That indifference can feel like safety, until it isn't. I realized I'd lost the trail when the ribbon of game path smoothed into leaf litter and my footprint stopped meaning anything. Behind me the air had the clean, antiseptic tang of crushed conifer. Ahead it had shifted into something heavier, metallic, like coinage left too long in a pocket. My breath tightened. I told myself to stay calm, to turn back and retrace, but the trees had thickened into a wall and every direction looked like a choice you make inside a maze. The thing that started as annoyance burrowed into a small, animal panic that tasted like copper. My hands, unloved, kept brushing the trunks as if memorizing texture could prove I was still in a world of matter and not in a story that rearranged itself around me. As I pushed on, my steps left prints that the earth seemed to accept and then deny, depressions filled with spiderweb needles, edges softened by wind. Sometimes I would look back and the pattern had altered, a few prints missing, or shallower, as if someone had walked there later the same way you smooth a bed to hide what was underneath. I laughed once, a brittle sound, and told myself the idea was ridiculous, that the forest was a poor theater and I was inventing actors to save myself from boredom. But small details are doctors of dread. I found a twig broken in any height, a smear of dark that could have been sap or something older. Then I saw the first sign that was not wilderness at all, a bootlace woven into a bush, looped with the careless cruelty of something meant to be hidden, not displayed. The lace jammed the air in my chest like a fist. I kept walking because my feet betrayed me, the way people betray themselves with habits. My camera swung useless at my side, its lens reflected nothing but the bed of leaves and the angle of my own shoulders. The forest narrowed. At one point I stepped into a small clearing and realized I'd been followed, not by an animal but by minutes, a ring of flattened grass where someone had sat, and beside it, an empty thermos with a sticker from a shelter in a town an hour away. Ordinary objects make terror plausible. Ordinary things show up in reports: missing hikers last seen buying coffee, a volunteer who didn't clock back in, a number called once and never returned. My mind supplied scenarios: hunters, someone trapped, a transient camp, and each benign hypothesis was a thin coat against the cold that pooled under my tongue. That evening the sky bruised the color of old wounds and the weights of shadow lengthened like something settling into a posture. I tried to mark my route with ribbon torn from my pack and a spray of bright, ridiculous tape, but when I glanced back the ribbons sagged as if some wind had rearranged them into new sentences. In my sleeping bag later the forest sang the way forests sing, small animals, a faraway branch snapping, a single, deliberate footstep that might have been my imagination or might have been the sound of someone walking the oval of the clearing, testing it again as though rehearsing. I lay awake listing names of friends, phone numbers, the exact text my partner would send if I missed dinner. I listened for solid human noise and heard instead of thin, uncanny mimicry. A branch brushed the trunk like a hand, and for an absurd second I felt like it had tapped my name. My rational mind refused the thought, then circled it like a predator does its prey. The sensation hardened into something else, the possibility that someone knew I'd been there, that my presence had been noticed and catalogued by eyes that did not want to be found. I woke with the taste of iron in my mouth and a new, blunt terror pressing behind my eyes. The tape I'd left at the last clearing, bright, ridiculous, had been cut cleanly, not torn. Whoever had done it had used a blade. My hands shook as I knelt to inspect the stubs, precise slices in the nylon, a method to erasure that felt personal. That small, clinical action made the whole thing intimate in the worst way. People don't stumble upon carefulness by accident. I tried to be methodical. I filmed the clearing, cataloged the items, logged GPS points. Science is a kind of prayer you tell yourself when the world refuses to be legible. But every note I made felt like a confession scribbled in the margins of a larger crime. I found a scrap of plastic with a partial license plate number, a cigarette but smoked to the filter, boot prints that overlapped my own in a way that suggested someone had stepped exactly where I had days earlier and tried to smooth over their intrusion. Each trace folded into the next, and the map I was making turned into a portrait of someone else's patience and calculation. When I tried to leave the trail to go back to my truck, the forest resisted. The GPS pen wavered and my compass needle whimpered as if indecisive. Paths I had followed that morning were gone, replaced by a maze of identical birches. I walked in a circle until my legs hummed. Panic is the mind narrowing to a single animal fact: survive. I heard voices far off, maybe hunters, maybe hikers, and hollered until my throat burned. The reply was a laugh that might have been carried by wind or by someone else trying to unnerve me. The ambiguity was a blade. At dusk I found signs of a camp, a blanket tucked into a low branch like a signal, a plastic tarp folded and hidden under brush. Near it, fresh charcoal in a cold mound and a scrap of foil wrapped around something that reeked faintly of diesel and canned meat. The camp was arranged for concealment, not comfort. Whoever used it knew the art of being unseen. My chest tightened at the thought that this was not a one-off, someone living out here intermittently, watching trails, cataloging who came and went. The idea that I might have been cataloged like an item in a ledger made me nauseous. I tried to think of reasons: a vagrant making shelter, a hunter avoiding poachers, a family staying off any grid for privacy. Each benign story fell apart when I considered the deliberate cutting of my tape and the meticulous smoothing of footprints. There was an absence where empathy should be. Instead there was a practiced indifference, a person or group who had decided who counted as human and who could be observed, recorded, and ignored. Night thickened into something viscous. I slept poorly under a thin tarp, one eye open, my camera within arm's reach like a small, fragile weapon. Every twig snap hacked into my bones. Once, a soft scrape near the tarp made me freeze. I whispered into the dark, and the sound that answered was nothing but my own voice carried back to me with a slight delay, altered, as if someone had learned to mimic my rhythm. The delay seeded a new terror, not merely that someone could be watching me, but that they had been listening long enough to learn me. Listening to be able to mimic is not benign. It is rehearsal. At dawn I packed silently and moved with a deliberate slowness, testing each footfall. I took different bearings, zigzagged, forced my path through denser brush, trying to confuse anyone who might be tracking patterns. For hours the forest yielded nothing but a quiet that felt too clean. Then, under a mossy log, I found a notebook wrapped in plastic. Inside were entries with dates, times, and observations, descriptions of hikers, male, carries camera, 3:10 p.m., nervous, small camera, likes to stop and frame light, notes on clothing, habits, the very mundane things that become dossiers when written down. The last entry read, new. Tests better than last. Wait. The sentence was written in a hand that was unhurried and merciless. I left the notebook carefully where I found it, because taking it felt like taking a trophy and because I couldn't bear the proof yet knew I needed it. The forest had become a room where someone had cataloged me as an experiment in invisibility. I felt violated in a way that had no recourse, the knowledge that my small rituals, my check-ins, my routes had been observed, timed, and judged. It's one thing to be lost, it is another to be mapped like a specimen. The notebook's existence turned possibility into a plan, and when plans exist, they can be enacted. The horror in that realization was pure and cold. I moved like a hunted animal, every sound a bell. The notebook burned behind my eyes, its neat cruelty replaying while I forced my feet through bracken that snagged at my legs like hands. I thought of the faces of people who vanish and become lists, photocopies in precinct drawers, voices on hold. The idea that someone had been making a file on me hollowed out my courage. Adrenaline did what it does, focused me into a single, terrible clarity. I would not be cataloged. I would not be a line item. I set traps of my own, subtle changes of direction, double back routes, false camp impressions, small theatricalities to confuse anyone tracking my pattern. The forest answered by becoming indecipherable, a tangle where memory and map bled together. At one point I dropped my pack and listened, head tilted, and heard a soft laugh that could have been a jay or could have been a man testing the air. The sound knifed through me. I discovered later I had been walking into an ambush of assumptions. The simplest noises become threats when you are primed to fear. My phone found a bar for a breath and I sent terse messages. Lost. Need pickup. Mile marker 5. I used landmarks I hoped made sense. Minutes stretched, minutes became a calculus of terror. When the replies were slow, bureaucratic, search team notified, ETA uncertain, the language felt like a membrane keeping the real response at bay. Waiting with knowledge that help was late is a particular form of torture. It teaches you that systems are not a safety net but an apparatus with holes. I wanted to believe rescue would arrive as in movies, bright trucks, yelling voices, swift extraction, but the truth we live in is frayed and patient. Footsteps came closer that afternoon, deliberate and soft. I froze, breath small, camera useless at my chest. A figure stepped into the slit of light, not monstrous in silhouette but ordinary, a person in weathered clothes, a cap pulled low, a face ragged with practice. He smiled like a man who knows how to be trusted. His voice was friendly, low. You look turned around, friend. You okay? My body wanted to leap to him with relief. Everything in me said no. Danger wears an ordinariness like armor. I lied calmly, said I was waiting for a friend, that my battery was low. He moved with a casualness that was performance, too casual, like a professional misdirection. When I asked him a few neutral questions about the route, his answers were vague, slipping like fish. He kept glancing at my pack, at my hands. The notebook's final line, tests better than last. Wait. Snapped into place in my head like a loaded frame. I backed away under the pretense of needing to check a bearing and watched him melt into the trees. Panic rose in my throat, equal parts animal and moral. I had seen the dossier, and I had seen the face that fit it. I ran. Running in the woods is a noisy betrayal of your position. It announces you to anyone paying attention, but it also breaks patterns. I crashed through undergrowth until lungs burned and knees slashed. I didn't know where I was going, only that motion felt like argument. When I stumbled onto a logging road, my relief was a fragile thing. I flagged down a pickup with a tired couple inside. Their kindness was immediate and blunt. "You look like hell. You okay?" I spilled the facts in jagged pieces, the notebook, the cut tape, the camp. Their faces changed in the way townspeople's faces do when a familiar fear comes close, recognition mixed with old, small resignation. They offered a lift to the ranger station. In the truck I watched the trees recede and felt the forest unmake itself into background noise. When the ranger heard my story, his jaw went flat. He called for a team, spoke in verbs that made things move: grid search, check old trails, interview nearby residents. The machinery of response began to engage, and for a moment the world seemed to align into something that might save me. They found the hidden camp after a day: tarps, canned food, a neat pile of cut ribbons like evidence of habit, and tucked beneath a log a plastic box with more notebooks. The handwriting matched mine in tone, clinical, observational, but the entries were not about birds or light. They cataloged human patterns: who stopped on the trail, what they carried, timings. The rangers found photos, blurred frames of faces at their daytime tasks, smiling, unaware. In a hollowed stump they found a small recorder with a file labeled simply with a date, the day I'd passed through earlier. Listening to it in the ranger's office, we heard my own footfalls and then a voice, low and amused, saying, "New sample tonight," as if the recorder were an item on a grocery list. The phrase landed in the room like a verdict. Arrests followed, slow and messy. We had enough to detain one man connected to a ring of itinerant observers who prided themselves on staying invisible, on turning trails into traps. The court filings were clinical, the headlines brief. In deposition, men with ordinary lives explained away their habit as a social experiment, as an effort to study human patterns, legalistic euphemisms that washed away the intimacy of their surveillance. The defense tried to dress curiosity in the garments of scholarship. The prosecution used words like harassment, stalking, and conspiracy. Families who had once been minimized by disappearances spoke into microphones with a new hardness. The legal world moved an edge towards something like accountability, which is an uneven salve on a raw thing. The aftermath did not repair the part of me that now listened for footsteps under bed sheets and checked locks until my hands cramped. It did not erase the sensation that the woods had made a file of me, pages slipped between bark, margins filled with observations of my gait and my pauses. There is a durable horror in being studied by other humans who choose to treat you as data rather than a neighbor. The fear that lodged afterward was not of monsters with claws but of people with clipboards who could, with patience and method, turn a life into a project. Months later I returned to the trail with others and retaped the blazes with bright ribbon. The forest accepted the color as if indifferent but not unkind. I photographed the light through branches, but now my pictures framed more than beauty, they were records, testimony. The notebook I had left remained where I placed it, pages fluttering in a wind that felt like a small, private reprimand. I still dream of footsteps smoothing my prints, of a hand cutting a ribbon with a clean, decisive blade. The worst part is how ordinary it all was: the voice that asked if I was okay, the friendly smile, the truck on the logging road. The horror that can be done by men in plain clothes, by patient observers, by bureaucratic words, is as plausible as cold and therefore more terrifying. I keep my camera close and my route shared now, because the woods taught me a lesson the hard way. Sometimes the trail finds you, and the thing that follows is not legend but a human design.